Hello, welcome to Color Light Motion, curated and hosted by Victoria Vesna. I'm Bess Rocklitzer, president of the David Vermant Foundation, and today we bring you Valentina Ravaglia. Valentina is a curator for the Tate Modern and recently curated the major exhibition Electric Dreams, Art and Technology Before the Internet. This show was of special interest to us because it included many artists from David's own collection. Thank you for joining us, Valentina, and please enjoy the presentation.
Welcome to Color Light Motion, episode 27. We feature Val Ravaglia, who joins us from London, where she curated a marvelous exhibition at the Tate Museum. Electric Dreams, Art and Technology Before the Internet. This show included many of the artists who were acquired by the David Vermant Foundation and are now in the permanent collection at the Butler Museum. Electric Dreams is an expanded version of the Dynamic Eye exhibition from 2023. Val organized the show into four main groups: Materializing Invisible Forces, Programmed Art Open Works, Dialogues with the Machines, and Electronic DIY Tinkering with the Tech. Her presentation will focus on aspects of research underpinning the Electric Dreams exhibition and its curatorial framing. In particular, she will examine the New Tendencies movement in the 60s as an example of the nuanced connections between analog kinetic art, perceptual abstraction, and the nascent field of computer art. Val's guests are Italian curator Francesca Franco, who tuned in also from London after seeing the show, and artist and curator Darko Fritz, who wrote an essay for the catalog and joins us from Zagreb. At the end of the presentation, they respond to the talk along with the other notable participants in the audience. This talk will prove to be a great resource for art historians and artists interested in conceptual and kinetic art before the internet. Enjoy the show.
I'm Val Ravaglia. I'm curator of displays and international art in Tate Modern. And yes, as you've just heard, I am still recovering from curating the massive exhibition, Electric Dreams, Art and Technology Before the Internet at Tate Modern, which is still open, still running until the 1st of June. And I'm here to give a little presentation on this exhibition. I realized that I kind of expunged the title of the exhibition from the title of the presentation, but my reasoning for wanting to talk to you about the new tendencies and the bridges between perceptual abstraction and early digital art is that that was my core preoccupation when I put in the proposal for the exhibition that then became Electric Dreams. Before I dive in, I just briefly wanted to thank Francesca Franco and Darko Fritz for agreeing to be in the responders for this talk, and also the David Vermant Foundation for their support of Electric Dreams, which very generously allowed us to go the extra mile with this ambitious exhibition. Yes, so the reason for me to want to focus on particularly the bridge between, let's say, analog types of kinetic programmed artworks and the early waves of computer and digital art is because I felt that there was a need to address this subject historically with an institutional exhibition. Although the story of the exhibition of Electric Dreams, as it has turned into the project that is currently at Tate Modern, dates back a few years prior to a touring exhibition with a vast majority of works coming from Tate's collection. Tate's collection has long had a strength in so-called Op and Kinetic Art. I will return to the so-called, but expect me using air quotes and being quite cautious when talking about definitions. But I will come to that in due course. So this is an exhibition that I was involved in to an extent. I didn't curate it in its initial incarnation, but it had its basis in some of the research that I had done for collection displays at Tate Modern. And the model for the way that the thematic sections of the exhibition had been put together was based upon some of the collection displays that I have been working on since 2015 and 2016, which was the period of time when Tate Modern was rehanging the entire collection displays in preparation for the opening of the extension of the building. And what at the time we called the new Tate Modern doesn't feel that new anymore, does it? It's been almost 10 years now. So the exhibition, The Dynamic Eye, was in itself quite an expansive transnational narrative of taking a sideways view at various international interpretations of notions of kineticism, permutational artworks, geometric abstraction with influences from constructivist, neo-constructivist, concretist, and neo-concretist influences. And it traveled to Shanghai, Pudong at MAP, then to Porto at the Atkinson Museum, and then to Istanbul. And by the time that the exhibition moved to Porto, I actually got an opportunity to take it over myself because Clara Kim, who's the curator who originated this project for the International Partnership Team at Tate Modern, had left us by then. And it seemed appropriate, given that I was already so close to the subject matter, I would take it on. And so I was asked to bring it to Tate Modern in potentially an expanded form. Partly because there were so many collection works in the exhibition, in the Dynamic Eye, as he was traveling, that one of the main preoccupations or objectives for bringing it to Tate Modern was to enrich it with more loans of possibly larger works that fill in some of the gaps about the ways that artists that worked in the space of optical kinetic new tendencies were, for example, also the initiators of some of the practices that would become known as immersive, participatory. And so there was an intention in general to bring the exhibition back to Tate Modern with more of those kinds of immersive artworks. Also kind of a predictable move at the time when, in order to attract visitors to exhibitions, it's usually a good idea to have large immersive interactive photogenic works that people can take photographs in and essentially expand the marketing of the exhibition in an organic way by using social media. Try not to be cynical about it, but this is, of course, something that museums very much look towards. And as I mentioned, this is actually art historically very cogent to the subject, because we're talking about a period of time that kind of established those practices. But I was very motivated to expand the scope of the exhibition further because I reckon that at this particular historical junction with mounting anxieties about artificial intelligence, and also several years of talking about generative artistic practices, digital artistic practices, in this kind of presentist mentality that doesn't necessarily take into account the historical genealogies of those generative algorithmic practices. I thought that this exhibition would be an opportunity for me to show the art historical existing and very intensely transnational links between the optokinetic practices and early digital art. although it feels a little bit like I shot myself in the foot, because the dates for when this exhibition was going to happen at Tate Modern were already fixed, and by then I had kind of a limited amount of time to develop the contents of the exhibition and make it into a consistent narrative that didn't get away from me. And I really mean it, because so in this slide you can see in the installation shot that is from the first room in the exhibition, that crazy diagram that looks like a printed circuit. And this was my way of kind of visualizing the connections between all of the artists that I selected for Electric Dreams. It's almost, I mean, it is literally illegible in the form that you have in front of you. And as a matter of fact, I've made a couple of kind of zoomed in slides to give you an idea of what the contents are. But also the importance of discussing this diagram for me is connected to the fact that this exhibition is kind of almost too ambitious for its own good, right? It's the intersections of art and technology in the post-war period and up until the early 1990s, just before the widespread adoption of the internet as a telecommunication technology, is a sprawling subject that a single exhibition at Tate Modern struggles to contain. But I had in mind to offer a series of viewpoints that could tell that story in at least a partial way, in order to give entry points to a general public to then research the subject a little bit more, find out more about the connections that are not explicitly made in the exhibition. And so in a sense, I say as much in the caption for the diagram that is in the caption on the wall in the gallery. It is necessary to understand this as a partial diagram, but potentially the circuit expands well beyond the limits of the frame of the diagram itself. It goes in a myriad other directions. The exhibition itself was conceived as a kind of a glimpse into aspects of this circuits of art and technology, but not as a synoptic or in any way encyclopedic view. So yes, my aim was to look at the evolution of mechanical and algorithmically generated art made between the 1950s and the early 1990s, connecting the work of early innovators in the field of kinetic, optical, and programmed art with the rise of digital art. And I wanted to do this by presenting a network of stories about the artists that found inspiration in the methods and tools of science and technology in order to amplify the formal possibilities and the sensorial reach of their work. So this was for me a way of talking about the general tendencies that connected those movements and organically led some of the artists to take an interest in early digital art or to uses of computers. Sorry, before I say this, my strategy in order to give some framing, some art historical anchoring to this narrative that could potentially become so sprawling, was to have 4 main group rooms around which the exhibition spreads out in sort of concentric circles. So beginning with a room that I titled Materializing Invisible Forces around the International Zero network, as well as a certain very small selection of artistic practices from London in the 1960s, and using in particular the Signals Gallery as an example of a space in London that was presenting a very international selection of artists. Right, moving swiftly along. So another group room that focuses on the new tendencies, and I'll come back to this in more detail, but it's kind of a pivot part of the exhibition that shows many of the practices that are most commonly associated with optokinetic tendencies. But I decided to particularly put the emphasis on the Zagreb events, the series of exhibitions and symposia and events organized in Zagreb that generated and sustained the New Tendencies movement as an international movement, and also to give a bit of space to the Arte Programmata artists from Italy that constituted a strong core of the artists that exhibited in the New Tendencies exhibition in Zagreb. Then another group room that looks at a kind of first wave of digital native or computer-aided practices. Although historically speaking, it's a bit of an expanded bracket, and I'll come back to this as well. And finally, another group room that is less about art historical moments and more looking at the attitude of tinkering with technology and turning tools from their utilitarian purpose into tools for creative art making. And admittedly, as I mentioned, this was perhaps quite a wide area for a single exhibition to undertake. However, I was also bolstered by the fact that no such exhibition had happened at Tate or really in a large institution in the UK for a long time, with the exception perhaps of the historical half of Electronic Superhighway, an exhibition that took place at the Whitechapel in 2016. And looking back a few years, the kind of legendary exhibition Force Fields, Phases of the Kinetic, curated by Guy Brett, for MACBA and the Hayward Gallery. So often when I was talking about my ideas for putting together this exhibition, one of the comments that I got was, I don't think I've seen anything that does that, that tells that story since the days of Force Field. And I thought, well, it's about time that someone does it again, not least because it also almost seemed like there was a moment when the exhibition, when I was putting together the exhibition, I didn't know, for example, at the time of my proposal that Tina Rivers Ryan was working on the exhibition Electric Op at the Buffalo AKG Art Museum. It's an interesting coincidence, and surely it's a coincidence that says a lot about the appetite for this particular trajectory to be recounted to a wider public at this particular moment of heightened interest in digital art. And really, it's a need to recover its genealogies from some of the more, let's call them, overlooked shelves of our history, libraries and archives. There have been other recent exhibitions that also look at these historical trajectories, particularly Thinking Machines, Art and Design in the Computer Age at MoMA, and Coded Art Enters the Computer Age at LACMA. They're not the only ones, there's other ones, but there's only so much time I can spend on this. And this is an installation view of the collection display titled A View from Zagreb, Op and Kinetic Art, that I curated at Tate Modern in 2016. And actually it stayed up for quite a long time until 2022 with a lot of internal swaps. So if you went back to Tate Modern, the view from Zagreb kind of shifted slightly every time you were there. But I'm particularly fond of the first incarnation of the room, because I included a series of works by Frieder Naka, Matrizen, Multiplikationen, Portfolio, that you can see here in the background. And also there was a documentary vitrine with the entire series of Beat International magazines that Zagreb New Tendencies put out, as well as a a few of the catalogs for the international exhibition. So in a sense, it was in my mind the version of this display that really conveyed that moment in Zagreb, that period of a certain years up till 1978 in Zagreb, as a shift or a bridge between the optokinetic tendencies and early computer art that would then essentially turn into what Electric Dreams has become. So I haven't said much actually about the new tendencies itself. And I already have to thank Darko, because he might recognize that he's the person that provided that image of the stamp of the New Tendencies group that is also on the catalog, in the catalog for Electric Dreams. So the story goes that in 1961, a young Brazilian artist that was living in Germany called Almir Mavigné put together an exhibition for the Galleria Suvremene Umiejętności. I might avoid trying to pronounce Croatian words because it's not my forte. In conversation with Croatian critic Matko Mestrovic and the support of the director of the Municipal Gallery of Contemporary Art, Božo Beck. This was the first in a series of exhibitions that kind of brought together a series of works that had a particular view on perceptual geometric abstraction, but with an attitude towards activating the senses of the viewer, and also a certain rejection of the individualistic artistic gesture that had contradistinguished practices like informal or expressive abstraction. And so the irrational, hyper-individualistic gestures of painting that was popular at the time is something that the artists that Mavigné was interested in and wanted to show together were trying to distinguish themselves from, and rather make a kind of art that was more rationally thought out, using sets of rules and essentially what we now understand as mathematical algorithms. And that from that point of view, we can be considered to be a kind of programming on the artwork, laying out a set of rules that then gets followed in order to obtain an image, a visual array at the end, or in other ways, the participation of the viewer was central to these practices. The exhibition from 1961 was followed by shows in Zagreb, but also Italy, Germany, France, and the group grew with larger and larger number of participants. And the name of the movement also changed from the plural to the singular as a way to try and convey a way of channeling the interest of the artist in a singular direction, or at least that was the desire on the part of the Zagreb New Tendencies of catalyzing the movement into a consistent movement. By 1968, the New Tendencies group had demonstrated an interest in computers as tools for art making, and they organized a symposium at the International Colloquy of Computers and Visual Research in Zagreb in 1968, which was quite the key year for a lot of key exhibitions of early digital art. And then in 1969, 1968 is when the tendencies for the series of events known as Tendencies 4 began. In 1969, they organized another exhibition of computer art. Apologies. And it goes without saying that the impetus for the curatorial logic behind this room in the collection display that I curated in 2016 was the BIT International Nuove Tendenze Computer and Visual Research exhibition that was held in Graz in 2007 and then in ZKM in Karlsruhe. And the publication, a little known story about a movement, a magazine, and the computer's arrival in art, New Tendencies, a BIT International, edited by Margit Rosen, with Peter Weibel, Darko Fritz, and Maria Gattin. Which was a truly monumental anthology on the subject and still is my personal go-to reference book on the expanded new tendencies field, kind of sitting firmly on my desk at Tate Modern pretty much nonstop since 2016. And again, I owe Darko and Margit Rosen a huge debt of gratitude for having laid such solid foundations for that modest 2016 display and for subsequent projects, including Electric Dreams. Yes, so having proposed this expanded version of the dynamic eye for Tate Modern, my immediate thought was to use that junction of the new tendencies as a useful anchor for bridging the earlier analog experiments with the computer arrival in the art, as the title of the publication spells out. And in particular, I thought that it would be useful to shine a light on the new tendencies to help provide a more layered narrative around what is sometimes framed under this hazy umbrella of Op and Kinetic Art. So again, this use of air quotes is due to the fact that I'm not too fond of using this particular umbrella moniker. And in general, I've been quite careful in using the terminology around it, both in the interpretation material for the exhibition and in the catalog. I mean, it's notable that Darko's essay for the catalog is titled Not to Op Art, so that's kind of a manifesto in its own right already on the subject. This is partly because the term op art itself was first used, at least in print, in a Time magazine article from 1964 in relation to the upcoming exhibition, The Responsive Eye, held at the Museum of Modern Art in 1965, curated by William Seitz. This exhibition is often credited with bringing the movement to widespread public attention. At least that's what the Northern American-centric narrative around the optokinetic movement would have us believe. But of course, if this term was invented in 1964, and by then there had already been plenty of activities around the kind of practices that were described by this term, that means that the artists that were working in those practices didn't necessarily label themselves as op artists or optical artists. And personally, I find more useful, for example, to use the term of perceptual abstraction, which actually is also the title of a section of one of the one of the paragraphs in the catalog essays for The Responsive Eye, because the catalog for The Responsive Eye itself doesn't actually use op. I think that the motivation for inventing that definition was also to have something that echoed pop art, and therefore as a kind of marketing label that was quite catchy and could be picked up. And lo and behold, it did, and it's still sticking to this day. But I think that having this label hasn't necessarily helped the case of showing what was behind or beyond the formal interests and the kind of geometric abstract patterning that these artworks demonstrated. There was also, before the Responsive Eye, an exhibition that is also often mentioned as a kind of key moment in the catalyzation of kinetic art, or art that uses movement as one of its primary components or its key aesthetic principles. And the fact that most of the artists in Le Mouvement also made works that can be kind of formally classified as optical, and that historically artists interested in kineticism, from the earlier 20th century avant-garde. So talking about Nam Gabo and Duchamp himself, who was featured in Le Mouvement, did so through kind of strictly geometric forms. Over time, all of this has contributed to the conflation of these two terms. Whereas personally, I see this as more of kind of a Venn diagram that has some overlap, but it shouldn't, like, it's not helpful to continue to narrate the two together. It becomes harder to justify this conflation, for example, when you end up wanting to historicize kinetic art in correspondence with optical tendencies, but then you have artistic phenomena like the more chaotic side of Tangeli's kinetic works. Just Homage to New York is an example to trump them all in terms of chaos. Or the kinetic works of someone like Felisa Burstyn, who, as mechanical as they might be, they also show kind of more of an organic type of movement to them. And I mean, there's nothing that I can easily classify as anything remotely related to optical works about them. So for this reason, I much prefer the framing of kineticism that Guy Brett outlined in the exhibition Force Fields, which acknowledged the role of interaction in a range of international movements, including Brazilian neoconcretism or neoconcretismo, which was one of the movements that Guy Brett was particularly keen to proselytize about. And yes, with the intersection of more organic and biomorphic tendencies that complicate the strict geometric patterning, for example, in the work of the Venezuelan Gego or Filipino David Medalla. And most of all, Brett's writing on the subject of kineticism kind of kept it theoretically distinct from the optical tendencies. And even when it comes to works that heavily rely on optical effects, as I mentioned, I think it's more helpful to refer to them as a kind of perceptual abstraction. Another aspect that is actually acknowledged openly in the catalog for the responsive eye is the new tendencies. So there is a section in the catalog that I'm going to quote from now. It says, many of the younger European artists in the exhibition have shown with the Nouvelle Tendance, an international fraternity of smaller groups initiated by an exhibition held in Zagreb in 1961. Although the members have no common program, they share a desire to sweep away the mystery and sacred separateness that was the atmosphere of a lyrical and tachist abstract art, striving only to permit a confrontation with visual situations. They do not ask that the spectator be a rapt admirer, but that he be a partner in reciprocal perceptual experiences. They try to make use of the newest methods and materials that industry has made available, the newest principle established by science, and even of mass production and distribution. They speak of the elements of their works as information and their compositional arrangement as programming. Now, these are the aspects of perceptual abstraction that gave depth to the related movements and practices beyond the illusory and seductive effects that characterized optical paintings or kinetic constructions when judged from a purely formal point of view. Of course, separating form from the effects and affects generated by those forms in the new tendencies works is kind of pointless because they're one and the same. My problem is that still today, this nuance gets buried under the form, and the fact that perceptual abstraction was also dismissed for a long time as kind of a passing trend, with a strong visual association with a certain time in visual culture, you know, kind of a space age, 60s, 70s, sometimes associated with psychedelia. And that also meant that the wider discourse around these formally geometric abstract practices and those artists' sociopolitical motivations ended up being dismissed and largely forgotten. So my interest in shining a light on the new tendencies is a strategy to recover these discourses as primary foundations and justifications for the formal experiments and not the other way around. Another reason for pointing at the new tendencies artists and the organizers of the Zagreb exhibitions in particular is to look at the other routes that those events took over the years that also point in different directions. One, which I can only mention in passing here, is that of the conceptual and process-based practices that evolved from ideas around connected notions of systemic art and systems art. So in the USA, this passage can be traced from Lawrence Holloway's systemic painting to Jack Burnham's systems aesthetics. But that same link was, of course, happening in parallel in other places in the world, including Zagreb. And inside this paragraph on the new tendencies, this aspect is kind of foreshadowed by his use of the word information as a unit. And one of the interests of the new tendencies artists. The other key term in that paragraph is the term programming, which is a notion that invokes ideas of automation, which in addition to the systematic nature of many of the new tendencies practices, makes it easy to see the adoption of computers by some of these artists as a kind of next logical step. As I hinted at, arte programmata was a key part of the new tendencies. A label, a terminology popularized by Umberto Eco in relation to a 1962 exhibition organized with Bruno Munari in Olivetti shops in Milan, Venice, and Rome, and was a touring exhibition. I think he continued to tour after that. Which feature works by members of the French Groupe de Recherche d'Art Visuel, Gruppo T and Gruppo N, all of whom also show with the new tendencies. And this art historical moment intersects with the history of Olivetti as an early actor in the development of computing. They were known for sophisticated typewriters, but Olivetti produced also Italy's first and I think only mainframe computer, the Elea 9003 in 1959. So in many ways, Italy could have played a much larger role in European computing alongside the UK and Germany if it wasn't for the premature death of Olivetti, the industrialist that ran the company himself, along with the groundbreaking Chinese-Italian engineer Mario Chu, who was the main engineer behind the Elea. And sadly, the premature death of both of them kind of destabilized or took away the trust that the company had in the project, and it was kind of phased out. And Olivetti itself didn't manage to establish itself as a strong computing presence. But I can only imagine that given the interest in arte programmata and their mecenatism that was already happening in promoting the arte programmata artists, had Italy and Olivetti persisted in its presence on the computer market, it's entirely possible that Italian computer art would have had a much stronger basis and literal funding through the sponsorship of someone like Olivetti. And of course, the notion of the open work or opera aperta by Umberto Eco was extremely influential as well. He developed this in 1962 after his embrace of semiotics and communication theory was part of a wider shift in his philosophical thinking. And the key essay theorizes a type of artwork across various artistic disciplines that has an indeterminate or variable form, whether because of chance processes or because of public interaction. He saw the notion as connected to that of open work. He theorized that artists use mathematical formulae in their work to give form to disorder, to find a kind of balance between order and chance, rationality and chaos, and as a principle for their artistic practices. In the context of the show, the notion of open work offers a counterpoint to the notion of programmed art as applying rigid mathematical rules and a different kind of more nuanced entry points to ideas around generative and interactive art. And it also offers a view on the growing interest on kind of certain philosophy like Zen philosophy that Umberto Eco was interested in. The new tendencies, the first edition in particular, also included a lot of the artists from the Zero movement. And now I'm going to switch and talk a little bit more about the works that are included in the exhibition. Many of the artists that participated in the transnational Zero group also showed in the first of the New Tendencies exhibition, and the influence and overlap between the interest of the Zero group and the early interest of the New Tendencies group were very high. In Electric Dreams, I've included works by Paul Bury, Heinz Mack, Jesus Rafael Soto, Jean Tanguy, the metamechanical sculpture that sadly has been in storage for a long time, and I finally had an opportunity to bring it out, but I haven't been able to have it function again. So it's sadly static in the exhibition, whereas practically all of the other kinetic works in the show are made to be functional, at least for part of the day or using a timer. Here you see Dada Maino and an array of chronotopes by Nanda Vigo, some of which have fluorescent lights in them. And I also included Heinz Mack's Telemack, which is an example of Zero's engagement with television and media and telecommunications at the time, as well as sort of being a veritable manifesto of Mack's embracing of technology and expressing his kind of visionary approach to the harnessing of light, where he's seen bringing reflective surfaces, including his own quite striking silvery jumpsuit, and he's seen walking across this desert in Tunisia, in the Sahara Desert, using his reflective sculptures and surfaces to really harness the power of the sun. And this is part of his view of what he considered to be a kind of ground zero or tabula rasa from which to start artistic vision again. I should mention at this point that recently there's been a talk about deserts not being just tabula rasa, empty spaces. They are, lived environments with their own populations. And the Sahara Desert, in popular consciousness as this identity as an expanse of empty space. This is really the way that Heinz Mack was approaching it, and I do think it's a slightly problematic way of thinking about the Sahara Desert. But this was kind of beyond the beyond Mack's interest in the desert as an area of pure possibility, which is another way that the Zero artists defined what they were interested in. I wanted to also include some permutational artworks that kind of anticipate the permutational nature of early digital art through a collage of work on paper by Mary Martin. And I included a visual automatic by Stephen Willets, which is a work that uses kind of environmental sensors to generate actual randomness, so not pseudo randomness created using permutative processes, but environmental variables that make it so that the sequence of lights in the yellow and blue dots can never be predicted. I've included works by Takis, including Telelumiere number 4, that has one of his magnetic ballets, and Sand Machine, a beautiful work by David Medaya. I feel like I'm going to have to run through the works that are in the exhibition in the interest of time a little bit. So consider this as a sort of literal sprint through the exhibition. And by all means, if you want me to delve into any of the artworks, do ask me questions afterwards and I can tell you a little bit more. Adjacent to the Zero artwork is a room, a light room by Otto Pina. Of course, Pina is also one of the artists that is included in the collection of the David Berman Foundation. The kind of a comparable kinetic light artwork that generates a sort of cosmic landscape on the walls of an exhibition space. And our Lightroom, it's dated 2007 because that's the date when Pina put the individual elements of this installation together, but is essentially composed of the same kind of works that he had started from 1960 onwards to exhibit together as light ballads. Then to skip to the next group room in the exhibition. Between the group rooms, there's a number of individual monographic rooms. So the ones that I've skipped for the purposes of these presentations are a monographic room about Brian Geise and another one about pioneering Japanese media artist and member of Jiken Kobo, or the Experimental Atelier, Katsuhiro Yamaguchi, who's very little known about outside Japan, and a figure that I wanted to shine some light on. But sadly, I'm gonna have to not talk about him for now. And so the next group room is the one dedicated to programmed art, Nobin works. Including works by Grazia Varisco and Davide Boriani, poster for Ivan Pitzel for the New Tendencies 2, a beautiful painting by Almir Mavigné, so the initiator of the exhibitions, of the New Tendencies exhibition itself, a work by Alberto Biasi that uses prisms, rotating prisms, to create this kind of iridescent effect. And one of my personal favorites in the exhibition at large is a luminoplastic motorized sculpture by Alexander Zrnec, which I'm ready to claim that it's never been shown in the UK, none of these luminoplastic sculptures. So it's really a mesmerizing work that uses projected slides onto wire sculpture and creates almost a ghostly effect. I mean, this is a work that really I should have included a video in order to give you a sense of what it looks like, but maybe it's better that I don't, so that you're enticed to come to Tate and see the exhibition in order to get a full sense. One of the works that I've included is a ceiling continual light piece, a piece from the Continual Light series of works by graph artist Julio Leparc. And there's a very similar piece actually in the Berman Foundation collection. And this is kind of typical of his experiments with instability that use nylon wire and reflective surfaces, either round or square or rectangular, suspended from nylon wires that oscillate with the movement of the air in the room that they're in, and with lights projecting rays of light directly onto the reflective surfaces, create a kind of kaleidoscopic effect. And we've provided, like the image that is shown here, a square bench that visitors can lay down on and just lose themselves in the effect on over their heads. The room also includes a work by Marta Botto, helicoidal chromokinetic sculpture from 1968. Again, Marta Botto being another artist that the exhibition has in common with the Berman Foundation collection. Other artists from the Italian Arte Programmata movement, including Marina Pollonio, with one of her circular dynamic, actually one that is was motorized at the time that it was created as a multiple in 1968. Well, the multiple with the motor was put out in 1970. The majority of Marina Pollonio's circular dynamics are spun by hand, but around 1970 she decided to do a number of multiples that were motorized, and in many ways they make it much easier for a museum to make it possible to have spinning discs by Marina Pollonio, given that they don't have to be touched by the public's dirty hands. And we also recently acquired the Marina Pollonio is now in Tate's collection. It's come in for this exhibition, and it's now part of our permanent collection. And so is the painting by Lucia Di Luciano, who was actually from a the Roman group of artists associated with Arte Programmata, so kind of lesser known with respect to the Gruppo T and Gruppo N, the Milanese and Paduan Arte Programmata groups, but still an artist who, with her husband Giovanni Pizzo, was present invited to show in Zagreb, and a favorite of mine for many, many years. I've also included some modular works that, in principle, artists indicated could be hung in any orientation and sequence. So the Paolo Scheggi Interena Cubo work from 1970, which is also a multiple and therefore represents kind of the one of the other interests of the new tendencies and Arte Programmata artists to make works that existed in several identical copies that could be sold for cheaper than unique artworks. And this was also a move towards a democratization of this type of artworks, which meant they were thematically accessible in the sense that the primary ways that this kind of works related to their visitors, to the viewers, is a kind of sensual one. You get, you don't need to have any previous information about what the artwork is. You stand in front of the work or in the same environment as the work, and they have a sensorial effect on you, and that is the primary entry point into the artwork. And then the reading of the the mathematical principles or the social principles that animate and motivate these artworks to make these artists to make this kind of artworks is kind of a secondary to the hooking the viewer with visual effects. This may sound paradoxical to what I was saying earlier, but for the artist, it was actually a way of thinking of their work as being more democratic, precisely because they didn't foreground the social content, but they foregrounded the sensorial effect, and then as an entry point into the their socio-political interests. There's a couple of installation views of these rooms, which continue with a small corridor dedicated to two artists that were part of the Groupe de Recherche d'Art Visuel, or GRAV, François Moreyer, and there's no caption for it, but the mirrors on the shelves are double vision mirrors by Julio Leparc that he created for his highly interactive game rooms. There's a room dedicated to Carlos Cruz Diaz, Chrome Interferent Environment. Cruz Diaz as well, a Venezuelan artist that showed with the new tendencies. And my reason for choosing this particular artwork for Electric Dreams is because it changed over time in taking on new technologies that were at Carlos Cruz Diaz's disposal in order to get closer and closer to the vision that he originally had for the Chrome Interferent Environment. So the original version of this work was with slides projected onto painted panels. And then over time, he adopted film and then video technologies to project the Chrome interferent patterns. And then eventually with his son, he generated he created a software generated version of this artwork, which is the one that we use in the version that is currently at Tate Modern, and the reason why is double dated 74 and 2009. But I find it quite significant that Cruz Diaz was one of those artists that considered the work to be the same artwork, despite the evolution of the technologies that made it possible. And then we come to what is possibly my personal favorite room of the exhibition. Maybe I shouldn't have favorites, but what can I say? I do. The group room Dialogues with the Machines, which is, as I mentioned earlier, dedicated to the early waves of computer-generated, computer-aided art, and takes the cybernetic serendipity, the London exhibition from 1968, as well as Tendencies 4 and 5 in Zagreb, which were the last two in the sequence and the ones that had a more overt thematic interest in the use of computers as tools for art making. I've included some of the Galois field light computer-generated artworks by Vladimir Bonacic, Croatian artist that was really key to this phase of the new tendencies, and that makes this really extraordinary works that are completely customized. The software, the hardware, the materiality of the artworks themselves is all custom made. There was nothing pre-existing. And Bonacic is also an interesting example of a new tendencies artist that came from a scientific background. He was a computer engineer, but kind of caught the wave of new tendencies, the interest that the new tendencies had in speaking through scientific ways of thinking and scientific forms of knowledge, and thought that he could put his knowledge of computers to use to make visual artifacts that could express the beauty of mathematics, in particular the kind of algebraic functions that he was working on, the Galois field, and make visual artworks that would then be exhibited with the new tendencies. Here's some installation shots of the Dialogues with the Machine room. Some of you might recognize Sam by Edward Ignatovic, the sound-activated mobile, which is kind of one of the iconic works from the Cybernetic Serendipity exhibition. And this is really a very compressed room to thematize early digital art. I am very aware that, there's so much that I wasn't able to include in this section, even though I also consider it to be kind of a thematic core of the show. It's partly because I wanted to show the variety of the outputs of works that were associated with cybernetics and computational processes at this time, and include artists from as many different countries as I could. So my selection was primarily based on geographical spread and to show samples of different kind of practices and the possibilities that were at artists' disposal with the actually limited functionalities of mainframe computers, plotter printers, impact printers at the time. There were only so many types of outputs that artists working with computers at the time could use. I wanted to make sure that there were a certain amount of three-dimensional works and reliefs as well. So that was a good motivation for me to include Sam, but also, do I not have a picture of it? Sorry, I'm going to skip ahead just because I want to talk about Robert Mallory's Quad 3, which is also a work in Tate's collection and what that was shown in Zagreb. Also, Helen Levitt's computer mill sculpture as a kind of 3D output, kind of to serve as a counterpoint to the majority of other works being 2D works on paper made possible through printing processes that were available to artists using computers at the time, from plotter printers to impact printers. Something like the Valdemar Cordeiro Gente Ampli 2 works that I've included in this room is an example of a work that uses an impact printer, but also one that, rather than using the strict kind of geometric patterning that computer graphics at the time lent themselves to, was trying to to use computer graphics to generate kind of figurative artworks. And so did Chark Suri, who is also included in this room with Sine Waveman of this particular print from 1967, I think was included in Cybernetic Serendipity, like the physical object itself. And again, is known as one of the earliest figurative artworks, digital artworks. There's so many more works, as you can see, that I have included in my presentation and I wanted to talk about. But as is usual for me, I have exceeded the time of my disposal and I've already gone on for an hour. So maybe this is a good time for me to stop sharing and start the conversation.
Wow, thank you so much for this incredible overview. It is truly a magnum opus. I mean, you have just created such an incredible context for this period of time. And the artists that are in the Vermont Connection that I've been looking at for decades now, we keep discovering more, but this is such an amazing overview that you gave us. Thank you so much. I would just ask our other guests to hold on. We have an incredible group who are interested in this. Carol Parkinson from Harvest Works, David Pavilion from the Beale Art and Technology, Erki Huchtamo, who's my colleague at UCLA. I see Larry Cuba is here too. But we really would love to hear, I guess, from Darko first, because you've been mentioned so many. You really provided a kind of a baseline dialogue for Val. So it's yours.
Well, thank you, Val. First, it's great for your great presentation. I found myself actually enjoying listening somebody talking about new tendencies after so many presentation I made from my point of view, and it was really enriching me from your point of view. We overlapped in many ideas, and we spoke before collaborating on your show about few like key ideas actually, and yeah, I'm so glad that also to see that this kind of artworks, very precise artworks that I see now in the slides, and I see with the little titles, they are belonging to certain museum collections. And I just, I mean, for me, it also bring me a little bit to my nostalgia trip while I was preparing as curator of the show that was mentioned. Thank you very much, Val, for this, for in Neue Galerie in Austria, and later an extended version in ZKM in Karlsruhe in Germany. When I was preparing this exhibition, actually many of these artworks I was finding in some living rooms of artists being there, and you know, those artists, nobody asked anything like for decades, and suddenly I find their contact. I just remember now, crossed my mind, yesterday I heard that Evre Huitik passed last month. As I'm on the way to Paris and I try to contact them, and then another group, member of the French group, told me that she passed. And I just remember, like 20 years ago, preparing this show in 2005, I was visiting them, and they had these beautiful boxes made of punch cards in their living room, and one was destroyed by the dog, and some children playing some long ago, and there are a few reminders like, please, I would like to exhibit this artwork, they're so great. And now I see they're in ZKM collection, and I see recognize some other artworks in Tate collection and other collections. And I'm so glad that that those artworks been completely forgotten at the time while I was researching that, including a lot of South American artists, and now they are recognized. for that, I mentioned French group, Gaive. There were a few. Marquette was also part of the Val exhibition I saw the show. The few members of Gaive group from Paris were presented in Electric Dreams. When I was searching for the contact, nobody didn't know the contacts of them, and then that's in Paris, Europe. Same story was in Netherlands, places you don't expect to hardly find information in 21st century. And then when you move to South America, and I don't speak Spanish, and that was even harder. But somehow, yeah, I'm so glad that the way Val put it, as well the way she was today talking about new tendencies, but maybe what she didn't show in this presentation, and that is part of the show, for me maybe was more interested in the context of like Dream Machine by Gyson, and this psychedelic turn and psychological research, not only visual, in more like, and do-it-yourself room with all artists that have been using copy machines and video and other technologies that also nicely frame this story that she was in this presentation focused on, and it's about basically about new tendencies and what was before and after, because maybe the new tendencies were so long span over from 61 to 73 with last show, 78 last event under that name, a symposia, and they include so many. That was umbrella network of many other networks of three completely different kinds that she explained. Well, nicely explained the first two networks of, like, let's say, non-digital artists using systematic works and arte programmata, programmed works, and then another phase with digital art. And there was another third phase that she just once mentioned about conceptual artists using system art and so on, that happened in 1973. So when we talk about we're talking about several hundreds of artists, and with many, many different umbrellas and terms, what everything is covered. And I'm really thankful to Val how she summarized all these complex ideas and how she interpreted in her way in Electric Dreams exhibition.
Thank you, Darko. You summarized it very well for us too. Thank you. Francesca, what are you thinking after this amazing presentation?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for inviting me and for Val for this really fascinating talk and for curating this massive exhibition at Tate. And I'm also glad to see so many familiar faces and names in the participants. So hi, everyone. I have some questions for very, very immediate questions for Val, because I'm passionate about this history and almost obsessed by the history of early computer art and pioneers. So I was really lucky to visit the exhibition in London. Am I the only one hearing this noise?
No, I hear it too. Like
okay,
a nice.
So,
yeah.
Good now.
Okay, good. So I was really, really glad to be able to visit the Tate exhibition in person, and particularly happy to see works by pioneers. I've been a huge fan of generative art like Vera Molnár, Manfred Moore, and Harold Cohen, featuring in room 9 dialogues with the machine, which was also my favorite. So I have two kind of connected questions. One is, how do you see their role within the larger story of Electric Dreams? And The other question, I mean, their work bridges a kind of fascinating gap between early computational practices and kinetic art. So I wonder what kind of dialogue do you think they create with the rest of the exhibition? So particularly with artists like Tsai, Le Parc, or Pine. So these are my two immediate questions for you.
I mean, for me, the main reason for surfacing these stories together and bridging them was to make it known to a wider public that some of the principles for artistic practices that use computation apply whether they have a digital or analog output, and the fact that historical practices that include kinetic works that use motors as way of programming the kind of visual loops within the work, and forms of automation that actually apply to sets of rules to follow manually, that artists follow manually in order to create the mathematically generated visual arrays. There is a direct line of continuity with the early digital works. Not only that line of continuity between the analog side or the analog, I sometimes think of it literally as a half, the first half and second half of the exhibition. But also that what we are now used to considering as a form of expediency of using the machines, of automating practices to save us steps, really did not apply to the early computational practices, in the sense that it was significantly more time consuming and just difficult in general for artists to even access a mainframe computer in order to be able to carry out those experiments. Many of those artists had to learn how to code in order to be able to experiment, to do their early digital experiments, or work very closely with computer engineers that were able to harness to use those machines. And then again, the outputs themselves, as I mentioned several times, there were very practical limitations. So some of the works that I've included take the form of photographs of oscilloscopes, because photographing an oscilloscope was the only way of having kind of a recorded version of certain digital artworks that only existed on screen for a limited amount of time. And so I kind of wanted to make sure that the aspects that early digital works have in common with works that are generated through mathematical rules, through what essentially are algorithmic rules, or that use a kind of analog programming through forms of automation, are understood as a line of continuity. And that's the reason why the new tendencies are especially helpful for me in this narrative, is because the new tendencies make that connection literal, because the new tendencies started with the analog practices and inserted the computer practices in parallel. And by the way, the computer-generated works didn't replace works in traditional media. They were shown in the Zagreb events in parallel. I think Documenta 4 was the one that also had a big kind of retrospective exhibition of works that had been shown in the previous 3 ones. So even at the time, there were establishing this complete parallel between the practices that use computers and analog ones. And then, of course, there is a huge part of the later half of the exhibition that I didn't even get to mention, where I try to make a point about particularly questions of access to types of technology, and the fact that the widespread adoption of consumer electronics made it somewhat easier for artists to be able to experiment in their own studios, or the appearance of the portable video camera, whether the Portabac or other models. essentially created a type of practice in the generation of electronic images that has completely, it was essentially a paradigm shift in creating moving images, and using flows of electrons, which is, essentially what the cathode ray tube and the video media supports were capable of doing, in a different language from previously existing lens-based media, and generating a way of translating electronic signals from one form into the other in a kind of continuous stream of light, electrons that hit the eye as light. But also the question of being able to access computers, mainframe computers, by befriending people in universities, or becoming what would we now consider to be artists in residence in research and development laboratories in corporations and such, also is a model that kind of is born at this time from the necessity of gaining access to instruments that aren't available to artists in general. And there is a room in the exhibition where I look at the international projects created by the Experiments in Art and Technology group, which is an entire sort of collective or interest group. Maybe it's a better way of describing what Experiments in Art and Technology aim to be. That was precisely seeking collaborations with engineers in order to get access, to give access to artists to kind of technologies that they otherwise wouldn't have. And so there is this kind of back and forth between artists finding a way of gaining access to the instruments that they wanted to use. And that room about early digital art hinges those formal concerns from the first half, and practical methodologies and questions of access that then become more present in the second half as well.
Thank you, Val. I see
Darko has been burning with a question.
While preparing this show, Val and we had several conversations, and quite long ones, some for hours, and that's something. It's about, like, when we talk about art and technology, and art and science and technology, I think we can talk about two streams that are bouncing. One is techno-utopian, another one is critique. And maybe with this majority of new tendencies been more like in this techno-utopian, but there was as well some members, and especially Gustav Metzger, who was participating quite prominently. Even he wrote Zagreb Manifesto as part of Computer Art Society London, when it was read at Symposia in 1969. And actually there was an exhibition by the top, we missed it in this presentation, but in Electric Dreams show, it's an model. Also, I had it in my show in ZKM Art Gallery. That's crucial work, 4 screens with computer. So, Val, can you maybe reflect a little bit about this criticism within the artist who deals with technology? And also we saw another very new tendencies, completely another line that is present in your show in Electric Dreams. This is Tanguy work and this self-destructing thing, also, by the way, that he shared with Gustav Metzger, but something that are not so affirmative toward technology, but including critique. Even in your show, it was much more evident, because I was limited in my shows on new tendencies only, that including Metzger, but in your show that was more present. So can you a little bit elaborate on this critique within on technology by the artists that are using it?
Yes, this is definitely something that I wanted to make sure was kind of thread going through the exhibition. precisely because there is a general understanding that the approach of artists working in the post-war period, so precisely in the period that is covered by the exhibition, is primarily, unbridled, optimistic one about embracing the possibilities of technology. While for me, perhaps because I am such a huge Gustav Metzger fan as well, I know that we have this in common, Darko as well. His cautionary voice about the dangers of blindly adopting new technologies, new, shiny new high-tech gadgetry unthinkingly was ever present. Of course, some of the artists that were working in this vein didn't necessarily, heed those Metzgerian cautionary tales particularly. But for the purposes of making sure that the exhibition gave a presence to the critical voice, I included a vitrine in the first room that has kind of an array, a small series of statements that start the exhibition and make an argument for some of the themes that will recur throughout. And one, by the way, is the All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace poem by Richard Brautigan, which I frame as a critique as well. Like, it sounds like the most techno-utopian, hippie, optimistic view of technology possible, but I'm convinced that it was always meant to be read in a critical and sarcastic tone. And there is a reproduction of a cover of one of the page newsletters of the Computer Art Society from the years when Gustav Metzger was the editor of the newsletter. I'm just endlessly fascinated by how wherever he had a little bit of space in the newsletter, he would include, illustrations in the style of Gustav Metzger, so appropriated from publications that he would find at the time that showed the ways in which computing was being used for military purposes, for surveillance and policing in a way that he was pointing towards as a way of warning that, to being too complicit as artists in the advancement of technologies have tools for surveillance will come back to haunt us. And lo and behold, here we are in 2025, measuring ourselves with this. Actually, I should say that there is, I think, a new exhibition by the Computer Art Society called List Scoundrels that kind of collects the cautionary tales from the pages of Page. Yeah, but also besides Gustav Metzger and his, interest in notions of auto-destruction and also auto-construction, which is kind of the obverse of the principles of self-destructing artwork, that he also applied in the digital realm by creating 5 Screens with Computer, which is a computer operated self-destructing monument, or at least it's the proposal for one that never actually got to be realized. And in the exhibition, I have a paper maquette that I didn't even know existed until I did the research for this show. It's in the papers of Beverly Rowe that are now in Tate's archive. And so it's this, it's literally like the same maquette as the metal one that exists, for example, in the Generali Foundation, but that he made just with paper and glue. And when I found it, it was flat and 2D as well, obviously being in an archival folder. So I must have been the first person in a long time to be able to pop it up like a pop-up card. It was really exciting. So there's that kind of work as well. But even zero artists in all of the, starting from scratch and taking like the imagery of the space race and taking rockets pointing towards space, they still made it quite clear that their intent was to reclaim technology from militaristic use. And someone like Otto Pina, who had worked in the Second World War as a, what's the term for what he did? It was anti-aircraft a sniper, essentially, I think was his role. So his works that used sky, light, and inflatable artworks, or the artworks that generate light ballets, as a way of reclaiming the night sky as well from the anxiety generated by the light ballets of the Second World War that were always very ominous because they brought destruction with them. And also another artwork that opens the exhibition is the Electric Dress by Atsuko Tanaka. Sadly, not the actual electric dress, but some works on paper and an image of Tanaka wearing the electric dress, which, again, is kind of misunderstood as this fun, colorful, wearable sculpture / performance prop. But the way that Tanaka talks about it is also laced with anxiety about the fact that it was potentially she could get electrocuted while wearing it. It was hot. It was very heavy. And that in itself seems to me to be kind of a summary of the attitude that people, especially in Japan, had in the early years of the post-war years, kind of processing what had happened in the Second World War and the nuclear explosions in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And so the sudden change of the urban landscape and the presence of neon advertisements, as she was seeing them from the station in Osaka, was an harbinger of kind of optimistic views of the future, but also thinking about technology and the destruction that it had wrought in the previous years was a source of anxiety.
Yeah, it's interesting also, as from early 60s to the late 60s, the discourse changed quite a lot. While naming the groups like Zero Group or Null Group, also these ideas of very early works that you shown in your exhibition that was presented at the first tendencies, didn't require any knowledge of the art history to enjoy the artworks. And that, in my interpretation, that was influenced by the notion of after Holocaust, after the experience of the Second World War, there's like that we need to start from the scratch. We need to start the history from 0 point. And I think that reflects in the names. That's my interpretation. Maybe I'm completely wrong. In Zero and Null and Azimuth, those kind of names that been late 50s, early 60s around. And then as well that we don't have any notion of art history, that we can enjoy the artworks completely open tabula rasa, and then we see the basic structural elements of what consists the visual image. And that's, I think, that's why they're always so simple. And they made permutations and so on. And then that kind of discourse changed by the end of the decade into what we can call postmodernism and things that get in more complex later, 68 and so on. I think it's also nicely shown in your show, this whole area. Yeah.
I think Erkki wanted to say a few words. Hi, Erkki.
Yeah, hi. So, of course, it's an extremely inspiring discussion, and would be great to, if I could, to see the show itself. So, I believe the pieces by Harold must be from that Tate show he did a long time ago. I wonder. So Harold was showing live his Aaron, I think, at the Tate Gallery sometime in the early 1980s or so, something like that. But anyway, so Harold was a friend, and of course a very much sort of like missed in many ways. So, but anyway, I have a couple of like a little sort of like maybe questions and comments. I try to be brief. So the so one related exhibition which I was lucky to see. So just before the world unfortunately closed for a number of years was the Le Diable au Corps, which was shown at the MAMAC in Nice, which obviously had a lot of op art and sort of like 60s stuff. Actually, a very inspiring exhibition. But so the point that this exhibition, so Le Diable au Corps made was really to emphasize these links between kinetic art, op art, and the popular culture. And I found that really interesting. So popular culture and fashion, something that I've been sort of like working on my so recently. And so it was interesting that you mentioned briefly the word psychedelia. So and it brings to my mind some sort of like chains of association. There was a famous exhibition of Aubrey Burchley that took place at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1966. And even though Aubrey Burchley's work cannot be easily linked with this sort of like kineticism or these things, it is interesting to what extent it seemed to inspire the certain kind of psychedelia in many ways. So I was astonished to sort of like finding out how what an impact one exhibition can have on a movement which happens in the arts, in fashion, in music, popular culture, all these things. So the cover of the Beatles' Revolver, very nice, very sort of like likely was inspired by sort of like Klaus Worman actually seeing the exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and then the rest is history. So I'm interested in this other side, which I don't know if that is very much like covered in this Tate exhibition. So all these links with popular culture. I'm also very intrigued, for example, about links like when we think about Gustav Metzger. I think that many of us here are big Metzger fans in many ways, and I always have my students read the manifestos for the auto-destructive art and things like that. But I'm also very intrigued these links, for example, the fact how certain elements of pop culture in England found ways of adopting elements of Gustav Metzger's thinking and writing. So and I'm not only thinking about the Pete Townshend destroying his electric guitars on stage, but I'm thinking about bands like the Creation, and how the Creation adopted the idea about acid painting from Gustav Metzger and actually started performing it as a stage act. And it, of course, inspired their song called the Painter Man. So this link obviously takes Metzger's ideas about the auto-destructive art in highly interesting and perhaps problematic directions. So I'm just kind of like, I just wanted to mention these couple of things that come to my mind. So how to what extent does the exhibition look at these ways how the things that happen within this certain kind of at that point very experimental art context actually sort of like kind of feed ideas into fields like pop culture, rock music, and psychedelia?
Oh, where do I start? Well, so Darko mentioned that in the exhibition I've included Brian Geisen's Dream Machine, which in itself is a kind of almost legendary origin point for certain psychotropic applications of luminokinetic sculptures, let's just call them. And of course, the beat literary environment that Geisen was a part of, being a close collaborator of William Burroughs and Bayles and Corso and other authors that were writing and collaborating with Geisen and Burroughs in that period of time. So there is that strength that is present in the exhibition, though, to be honest, I do limit it to the room. Not least because Geisen himself, was kind of operating in primarily in isolation from practices that were going on at the time. So it felt right to me to have a Brian Geising monographic room and then move on. But also, rather than framing it as pop culture or relationship to pop culture, I look at the interest taken by 1960s countercultures, like the San Francisco, Hyde-Ashbury, hippie environs that Richard Brautigan was a part of. And so the fact that there is a poem, that there is Richard Brautigan's poem in the vitrine in room 1 is already kind of launch pad for that connection to the San Francisco techno hippies and their take on, the philosophies that stemmed from certain conversations around cybernetics as a holistic philosophy of systems that made it possible to think of relationship between humans, their environments, and machines in one fell swoop, because the concept of cybernetics was, to conceive of systems of feedback and control that brought all of these aspects together. And then I have in the electronic DIY room that I didn't really get to talk about, I've included the Whole Earth catalog, which is another whole direction that the intersection of art and technology and countercultural thinking takes us towards. I don't think I've got enough time at this point of the evening, well, evening for me, morning for the Americans, to go into much detail with it, but it also kind of connects the content of the exhibition with the, Silicon Valley oligopolies that have formed on the shoulders of people like, oh my God, I can't think of his name. What's the name of the Whole Earth catalog guy? Please, someone help me.
Stuart Brand.
Stuart Brand, yes. And the fact that people like, oh my God, why am I so flighty tonight? The Apple, the founder of Apple,
Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs would
Steve
mention.
Jobs, and to think of it in context of, well, two things for me. 1969, when we first saw our planet, from a distance, which created the whole Earth and environmental movements, of course. And then today, right, where we're just viewing the oligarchs of the tech industry that actually started in that moment as well. So this is all just so mind-blowing, and it could keep going. I just want to say one last thing that wasn't mentioned, and that's sound. Kinetic art is very much about sound. And Carol Parkinson is here, and I know she's probably thinking I'm probably asking the questions for her. But when most of those artists somehow are really predecessors of sound art, and then the mixing of what's going on now, which I think is really wonderful, where the sounds and the visuals are looked at as frequencies and vibrations, etc. So just to kind of ask you one last question, because I've been sitting on it. How did you deal with sound as far as curating the pieces?
Well, I was preoccupied from the get-go about what kind of soundscape the exhibition would create, right? Because it could immediately become a cacophony, as is often the case with exhibitions that have a lot of time-based media works that have sound associated with them. And so when I was designing the exhibition, I was kind of always mindful of making sure that certain works with sound had a kind of presence in the exhibition and kind of anchored them, and also created a soundscape that accompanies the visitor through the various rooms. And to make sure that other ones had their own more contained sensorium, so that some artworks that really need for the audience to stay with the sound of them, that they could be put on headphones and not create too much of a cacophonic effect. Actually, a confession is that I initially thought of including another one of Atsuko Tanaga's legendary early artworks, Bell, which is also considered one of the origin points of sound installations, right? And like the Electric Dress is kind of this work that came out of nowhere, like there was nothing like that being made in Japan or anywhere else at that time, of a series of automatic bells that create a soundscape that moves in space over 40 meters, a 40 meters long piece of cable, right? And so one of my ideas for the exhibition was to include Bell. And then I realized that because of the way that the galleries are, if I have these bells, they're gonna like take over the sonic landscape of the entire exhibition. I can't do that. Yeah, so that was
Sounds amazing, though.
Oh yes, I still want to put it on display at some point. And then there's works by Takis, for example, that incorporate sound. Like literally one of the two works by Takis that I've included in the second room is a kind of self-playing instrument that uses a magnet and a magnetic oscillating effect to make a piece of metal strum an electric chord. And so, yeah, so there's works like that that kind of punctuate the exhibition and lead you through the pathway of it. Because, yes, all of these works, well, not all of them, but many of them very much incorporated sound as a integral components of them. And actually, I really wanted to include one of Vladimir Bonacic's light reliefs that also include sound, so computer-generated sound from pseudo-randomness that accompanies the sequence of visual lights. That would have been incredible. Maybe one day again.
One day, yeah. I remember, and some of you who visited the foundation when it was in San Ernest, if we turned everything on, it was just like insane cacophony. So that could be okay for 15 minutes, but not for a long-running show.
You have to think of the invigilators in the galleries as well.
Yes.
They get bombarded.
Well, thank you, everybody. This was just fascinating. I think we could keep going, especially with the people in the Zoom room. It's so much knowledge in one place and different time zones. We have New York, LA, London, Santa Barbara. It's wonderful to see you all. So all the best. Thank you so much. Val, thank you. This is really incredible work that you put together. It's just amazing. I feel so sad I can't see it.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for being here, listening to me go on and on.
Bye. Bye. All the best.